him, magic was becoming what the best one possibly could become. So when asked about magic, he said, and the initiatory powers conferred by this system of his, he said, "Seek no other measure of magical power than that of your internal power. Do not judge another being except by the light they emit," or don't emit, I would add. "To perfect yourself by becoming luminous and like the sun to warm the latent ideal life around you." So get there yourself, and like the sun, just transmit that to the people next to you. Do that, they'll get to the people next to them. And that's how his grand vision worked. He thought, well, if I can get to a few, that can increase exponentially. Didn't work, but it was a nice idea. This, he says, is the whole mystery of initiation. So for him, this was the ultimate purpose of this initiatory system. And contrary to most initiatory systems, Peladan's was out in the open. Secrecy for him was absolutely pointless. This was something that had to be shared, and this is why you get newspapers of the time, Rosicrucian Salon, and Peladan holding court, writing reams in the newspaper, trying to communicate this. It's pretty surreal, and it explains why eventually he was written off as an eccentric. But in fact, there's a very peculiar cohesion and coherence to his system. Okay, these are more definitions of magic, which I won't tire you with, but the essence is this. He says, before you can even think and choose, society shapes you to its rules. You have 3 destinies, and this was aimed at young men. He has different messages for young women. You have 3 destinies. You can be an animal, a savage, an anemique, like everybody else, or a spiritual man like St. Thomas or Dante. And these were some of his saints, as far as he was concerned. As an animal, if you're going to be an animal, if you're going to be part of the mob, he says, be beautiful. It's quite a message. As an anemique, be good. Seek the Grail. I cannot give you the philosopher's stone. I can only emancipate you from instinct and society. Now, Peladan wrote 3 initiatory handbooks. One for young men, one for young women. I say young, but it seems as if he's writing for younger people. Perhaps because he believed they were still malleable, they were still open to change. Maybe he does often write, and you, young man, for example, in one of them. So one for men, one for women, and one for artists. Now, for artists, they got their marching orders about what they needed to do and why they needed to do it, and they needed to be in the service of the angels. That's artists taken care of. For young men, he came up with an incredibly complex system. I'm not going to read through this. If anybody would like the PowerPoint afterwards, just drop me an email. I'm happy to share it. Now, it had 7 levels or degrees. Each degree had a mystery, a virtue, a gift, a beatitude, a duty, a guardian angel, an arcanum, a secret teaching, and he also associates it with Assyrian and modern astrology governing this particular level of consciousness. And he wrote, and this particular book, How to Become a Mage, it's called, is divided into 7, covering the 7 degrees, and then a further 12 subcategories according to both Assyrian, the Assyrian pantheon, planetary correspondences, and Kabbalistic correspondences. He has thought of everything. It's all in there. Hugely complex, but also very curious to see that in the end what he's saying is let go of what society is telling you to become and look at yourself and see what can you really become, and then begin to implement that in your own life. Now, how to implement that, he called kaloprosopia. Kaloprosopia is a made-up word. It's his word. It's from the Greek, kalos, which means good, and prosopo, which means face or person. And basically, the best way I can sum this up is fake it till you make it. That's actually what it meant. he said, make the acts of faith and the faith will come, quoting. I think it's St. Thomas Aquinas. So, or is it, no, it's Augustine, not St. Thomas Aquinas. What did he mean by this? And this explains why he went around wearing purple robes and why he went around calling himself Sâr Merodack or the Prince Merodack. It was because, he said, even if you don't feel it, you don't have the confidence, you're not sure about it, it doesn't feel real to you yet, if you begin to enact the role of the person you want to become, of the initiate you want to be, and you try to implement that in all your behaviors and in your looks, and you treat your life and your appearance, every aspect of your life, as if it's a painting you're creating, as if it's a play you're acting in all the time, sooner or later that becomes internalized. And that's when you know it's become real. That's when you know it's become yours. So for each of the initiatory steps, degrees that he proposes, he gave very, very detailed instructions how to deal with various social situations, all the way down to food. First thing he says is give up smoking, don't go to cafeterias, and don't read newspapers. That's one of the first things he says. I agree about the newspapers. Yes, and so that's the essence of it. It's the essence of, first you need to cast away the trappings of society, and then you need to at least act like you mean it. Eventually, it will become a reality to you. As for the ladies, because that was for the men, as for the ladies, Peladan has earned himself a reputation as a misogynist, which is actually based on a misperception. He was not. What he disliked intensely and does rail against, but people need to have often taken that out of context, is what polite society of his day had made women become. If I just go back to that slide, you've got a lady in a very tight corset chained to a dressmaker's dummy, and behind her you've got a Medusa, sort of the wild feminine, howling because the woman cannot be everything she is meant to be. So this kind of encapsulates this particular message. And as he says here, from boarding school, where spontaneity is reprimanded, to the salon, where again games of wordplay and double meanings are forbidden to her, the modern woman obeys negative commandments. So basically he hated what women had been turned into by these kind of social rules. To wait, to refuse, to retreat, and to be silent, there is the entire expected behavior. Well, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, polite French society, probably true. It's still true in some societies today. Society, which is more selfish than anyone because it is made of general selfishness, overwrites the individualism of souls as if with a state decree. Now for ladies, he didn't have such a carefully structured system, because he believed that men and women had different faculties, different attributes, and needed to approach this differently. But for women, he believed they needed to look into the most powerful female archetypes of the past, and he said that women would be either princesses, by which he meant warrior princesses, not princesses in the town, not little girl princesses with too much pink. So, and he held up examples of women warriors of the past, Amazons, queens in antiquity, or what he called fairies, by which he meant muses. The women who would quietly and gently, who did have a stronger connection perhaps to the spiritual world, and who could use that to inspire and to touch others. And then, of course, there were the women who would never be able to break the societal strictures, and who belonged to the mob, and who they were the ones he railed against, and that's why he got a bad name for it. So those basically were the more practical solutions that Peladan offered for people who had understood there was somewhere to go with this idea, who felt that there was something they wanted to do with it, and his advice for how to approach it. And he did it himself. Now, of course, by doing it himself, he earned himself a terrible name. He was ridiculed during his lifetime, despite being so prolific, despite being extremely influential as well across the border, and outside France, and as far as Latin America and Russia, in fact, his influence reached before and after his death. But esotericists, his fellow esotericists, did sort of ridicule him and buried his work, sometimes also appropriating parts of it for themselves in the process. I've been able to document that as well. So, you know, here we are 100 and something years later, wondering, well, why do we need to know about Péladan, and why do we care anyway, apart from the sort of academic, historical sort of side of things? Well, just like Péladan's time, where he was early 20th, less and less so in the build-up to World War I. Just like then as now, was a period of uncertainty, of flux, of change, of not quite sure where we're going, but we're going wrong some places. Very similar period to today. Some historians would probably agree that a lot of the issues, at least in the Western world, that we're facing today, politically, geopolitically, socially, are issues that have been problems since before World War I. We haven't solved them yet. And for the best part of the last century, they are still plaguing us, and the repercussions are still here. What did Péladan and his circle do back then? They looked to the past for solutions. They went back and they tried to reinterpret the past. They tried to look for answers before, in their minds, things went wrong. A lot of people are doing the same thing now. Suddenly, interestingly, this period of history is becoming, and especially the esoteric goings-on during this period of history, are becoming increasingly sort of popular. People are looking at them again, and I think it's for the same reason. My belief is, it's for this, as an esoteric historian, my belief is it's for the same reason. Looking for something we missed last time round, looking for something that might have fallen through the cracks. And then there's the question of the art. Can art practically really offer us something? I mean, I'm sure we can speak about this on a spiritual, esoteric level, but on a very practical level, I would say art is something that bypasses the logic, common sense. It's something that speaks deeper. It's a place where we can explore, we can experiment, we can put something, we can look in a mirror using art as a society, not just artists, but as a society, as a culture, as individuals, and as communities. So Péladan's emphasis on art was for a very specific purpose, but art that actually tells stories, art with a message, art with a meaning, and we've had far too little of that as sort of abstract art has gone through its popularity phase. Perhaps there's something more to be said there for art that can be talismanic, that can say more, that can become something to work with and to enter into a dialogue with. Peladan's kaloprosopia, well, fake it till you make it, that's nothing esoteric, that's nothing mystical, but it's also something that works, and everybody who's ever suffered from stage fright or imposter syndrome will know that. So anyone who's ever gone through a job interview will know that. So is there any point in looking back at his system? Well, it's a very interesting series of steps. It has a lot of interesting things to say about the way society acts on us. As an individual, I pride myself on still being a nonconformist, yet I was surprised reading Péladan to notice his observations of often insidious ways in which society can sort of, yes, grind us down. It's worth being conscious of that. It's worth remembering that if we want to be true to something deeper in ourselves, because the daily grind really can get you down. I think you all know that, especially if you live in a big city. So that's another thing. Is there more? Is Péladan's aesthetic, is his way of speaking about this something we can get something from? And yes, I come back to art as a tool for transformation on numerous levels, and it's also worth revisiting the art of that period and seeing how powerful was it really? Because actually it did have quite a lot of influence. It's just that never made it into the history books because the art historians didn't really know what to do with it. And I've got a story I can't tell you about that, a very current story I can't tell you about that. But the fact is, art has always been a method for a culture, for a society to re-examine itself. And at least on that note, I think Peladan has something more to say to us.